The story begins on Felucia. Anakin Skywalker, Plo Koon, and Ahsoka Tano tracked down the battle droid reinforcements settled on the planet. They decided to attack before the droids could secure their position. Anakin was to lead a frontal attack. Koon came in from the flank, and Ahsoka was to scale the base's back wall with a clone trooper detachment, an assignment which she accepted with the usual cocky exchange between her and Anakin. As Ahsoka was securing the perimeter, Trandoshans in the forest took interest in the young Jedi. Trandoshans were cowards. They always captured only prey they knew they could take down. Except this time. Somebody else caught the Trandoshans' attention, General Skywalker. They personally would not dare to attack a Jedi Knight, but this was General Skywalker. They couldn't just pass up an opportunity to capture the war's poster boy. They had to make a decision. Do they take the youngling or Skywalker? And they decided on the big guy. So the Trandoshans sneaked around the perimeter behind Anakin and aimed the stun blaster. This one would be a little more difficult. He was surrounded by clones, but still, the Trandoshan fired, immediately knocking Anakin out cold. Thankfully, most clones were preoccupied with blasting back at the droids to notice it. Still, two clones closest to Anakin did notice, and just as they turned, the other Trandoshan blasted their heads off. The two Trandoshans quickly grabbed Anakin and pulled him into the wastelands of Felucia's thick forests. They removed his lightsabers and dragged him into their base camp, where they were sure they'd be rewarded for their newest captured prey. And they indeed were. So Anakin was taken along with some unfortunate other life forms to one of the greenest Trandoshan moons. As the Trandoshans were finishing their transport, Anakin caught the attention of a high-ranking Trandoshan bounty hunter. He asked the other Trandoshans if they were insane. This is Anakin Skywalker, the hero of the war. Imagine the bounty they could get from the Republic if they returned him. So Anakin was instead left on a Trandoshan building high in the sky above the hunting island. The bounty hunter had an idea. Assuming the war would keep getting more and more intense, and the Republic would desperately be looking for their Jedi general, they should wait. The young Jedi would surely keep growing in price. Unknown to the bounty hunter, this war was far from a typical war, and Palpatine would not hesitate to execute Order 66 when the time came, wrapping up the war faster than expected. And to the Galactic Empire, the Jedi were useless. Perhaps they would want him to execute him, but one thing was obvious. They wouldn't pay, they would just take. So Anakin was frozen in carbonite. Anakin's ears were ringing. He couldn't see anything. Everything was completely dark. All he could hear were uncanny high-pitched noises around him. He couldn't say what they were talking about, though. The ringing was too intense. Suddenly, Anakin felt a boot slam into his stomach. He grabbed his abdomen in pain, but then came another kick, or rather a punch to his side. Suddenly, the ground beneath him disappeared. He was falling, and naturally, to every fall followed a hard slam to the floor. Suddenly, he landed on his side, ribs cracking, his stomach twitching as he screamed in pain, blood spraying from his mouth. But things just kept getting worse for Anakin, as he felt the thing he despised most in the entire world below him: sand. He just laid there for a minute in pain. As his vision started to return, he crawled onwards through the jungle. Crawling shifted into walking, and walking into painful jogging. Where was he? What was happening? The answer came quickly and brutally. As a blaster bolt came flying toward Anakin, he dodged in pain. He took cover in agony as another blaster bolt came flying toward him. He couldn't focus. His ribs, his stomach, the ringing in his ears, it was too much. Suddenly, an arm came flying his way. He dodged at the last second, grabbed the arm, and slammed it into the torso of the attacker. But he just heard an uncanny laugh as the attacker slammed his weak body to the ground. Anakin was mad. He kicked the attacker as he collapsed to the ground. He grabbed him, but the attacker just rolled back, kicking him with both feet and sending Anakin flying. The Trandoshan stood up and started walking toward Anakin to finish it, but Anakin was mad. He turned, lifted his hand in the air, and lifted the Trandoshan with a force choke. The Trandoshan begged for his life, but Anakin didn't stop. He couldn't. Forget the Jedi code. He had to survive somehow. The Trandoshan's body twitched in pain and eventually became still. Anakin crawled to the lifeless body. As he suspected, Trandoshans. Those sick Bantha Poodoos were probably using him as target practice. Anakin didn't hesitate. He grabbed the Trandoshan's blaster and his disgusting jacket, which he sadly had to wear from now on. He stood up in pain and started walking in a random direction as quietly as he could. He found a small shelter under the roots of a large tree. It was empty though. Those monsters probably already killed whoever was once surviving in there. So he crawled inside and closed his eyes in pain. It was obviously not a good idea to sleep here, but he knew he didn't really have a choice. If he stayed awake any longer, he would just collapse from exhaustion the next day. He just hoped the Force was on his side as he closed his eyes. When he eventually woke up, the blazing sun was cooking his legs. He had no idea that such a cold night could turn into such a boiling, burning heat in just a few hours. Well, he did know. He grew up on Tatooine, but still, he expected that this planet with lush forests and oceans would have a more balanced atmosphere than that. Thankfully, he felt a lot better than yesterday, so he stood up and started exploring the nearby area. Almost like a miracle, he soon stumbled upon some used bandages that he used to hold his cracked ribs in place. He walked and climbed. He didn't really know if he should expose himself in hopes of finding some kind of transport after dealing with the Trandoshans, or if he should stay low for now. But soon, the Force chose for him. A squad of Trandoshan hunters was examining the nearby area on a repulsor lift-powered platform. This was perfect. He could use the platform to escape. So he leapt onto the platform and, with a ferocious kick, sent 2 Trandoshans flying to the ground below. The remaining 2 drew their blasters, but Anakin rolled and punched one of them directly in the ribs as hard as he could. A nice revenge. He kicked the other in the stomach. The Trandoshan grabbed his abdomen in pain as he stumbled backward over the fence and fell to the ground. Anakin knocked the last Trandoshan out and sent him flying to the forest ground below. He didn't hesitate. He grabbed the controls and directed the ship toward the beach where he had been dropped on the island yesterday. He figured that either there was a platform nearby that place, or at least the Trandoshans had to be traveling to that area often. When he arrived at the beach, he saw a big ruin of what appeared to be a ship he hadn't noticed the day before. That made sense. It was night, and he was blind. He flew directly upward until he was high in the clouds, and then he saw it. A large platform far in the distance. Not now, he thought. He'd have a significant advantage at night. So he flew back to the ruined ship below. He made a small camp inside the ruins. He found a lot of good stuff, medical supplies, and also some ration bars. Anakin was surprised this things hadn't been looted. Either there weren't many survivors in the forest, or this beach area was way too dangerous to even attempt anything, and it proved to be the latter, as a few standard hours later, Anakin heard the sound of another platform approaching. Another squad of Trandoshans. This time, Anakin couldn't rely on just knocking them out. He simply didn't have a choice. If they discovered the empty platform, they'd inform the others. So Anakin grabbed his blaster rifle and shot at one of the repulsor lift pads under the platform. The platform spiraled uncontrollably, landing hard in the water. He decided he couldn't wait any longer. It was dark enough anyway. He climbed onto the platform and flew directly up, as before. It was harder to find the large platform in the air this time. It didn't have any illumination at all, but nonetheless, Anakin landed near the platform. He didn't get too close though. He didn't want to attract any attention. So, he flew above the platform and jumped down. He landed hard, harder than he expected. He almost screamed as he felt a burning pain in his ribs again, but there was no time for waiting. He sneaked into the central area. He figured that was where the main communications would be. There was only one Trandoshan guard he had to deal with. After that, it was easy. Trandoshans were really underestimating their prey, except that Trandoshans mainly only hunted kids. That made Anakin even more mad. He sneaked inside the building and punched in the secret Jedi encrypted signal to contact the Order, but something was wrong. He only got static. That was weird. He tried doing it on another computer, but he got the same thing. That was weird. Perhaps the planetary communications were down, or something. How was he not getting any signal at all? Then he heard a voice and hid under a table. It was the bounty hunter. He nervously stepped into the room with 2 other Trandoshans. Anakin couldn't quite make out the whole conversation, but it was obvious the Trandoshans were talking about him. How could you Sleemos lose the Jedi at the beginning? We thought he was just normal prey, sir. Does he look like normal prey? He's a Jedi frozen in carbonite. He's been there for years. Years. What did they mean? Years. No, it couldn't be. Anakin had to shake it off. There was no time for an existential crisis. Thankfully, the bounty hunter had arrived with his personal ship. Anakin carefully sneaked back outside and climbed onto the bounty hunter's ship. The layout was a little confusing and protected, but nothing too hard for Sky Guy, so he took off, climbing through the atmosphere steeply. He almost expected to be chased by starfighters, but he almost forgot. They were Trandoshans. They were good at hunting down kids, but not exactly civilized enough for piloting anything really. So Anakin jumped to hyperspace, towards Coruscant. In hyperspace, he couldn't stop thinking about what the bounty hunter had said. Was he really frozen in carbonite for years? There was no way. What about the Jedi encrypted message not getting any signal? How was that possible? Maybe the Trandoshans just had really janky communication systems. He didn't dare to think what the alternative could be. As the ship came out of hyperspace, Anakin immediately thought that Coruscant looked weird. Through the years, he had memorized the light patterns of the planet, especially the Federal District. There was just something odd about it. Anakin flew to the surface of Coruscant, not just anywhere, but on official sky lanes. He didn't want to attract attention, just in case. He flew toward Padme's apartment, but he glanced toward the Jedi Temple, just in case. His thoughts collapsed as he saw the Jedi Temple was different. There was something wrong with it. Was he going crazy? Was he dreaming? He immediately changed the lane toward the temple, and as he got closer, a horrible realization consumed him whole. The Jedi Temple had flags on its surface. He didn't even know what he was looking at. On the flags was an emblem, but not the Republic's. Anakin didn't recognize it. He landed near the temple, stepped out of the ship, and looked at a corporate sign before the Jedi Temple. It said, Imperial Palace. At that moment, Anakin collapsed. This was too much. He slammed his head on the floor. This is all just a crazy dream. He'd wake up any time now, but he didn't. So he got back into the ship, tears running down his face as he took off toward Padme's apartment. But the Senate apartment complex was gone. It was not there anymore. The buildings were gone. How? When? Anakin just sat in the ship for a while before flying toward the nearest access shaft and traveled deep into Coruscant's lower levels. Not just a few levels lower, but as deep as it was safe to go. When he got out of the ship, he expected to see a Rhodian Death Stick trader or a gang member threatening to steal his ship if he didn't move it somewhere else. But instead, he was greeted by two clone troopers. Their armor and voices were different, but they were clone troopers. They had to be. "Hello, sir. You cannot park this vehicle here." Anakin just asked, "Why are your armors white?" The stormtroopers looked at each other before one of them suddenly swung at Anakin. Of course. Anakin dodged and ended the fight immediately with a strong force push. What was this? Since when were clone troopers so aggressive? From there, Anakin went into a pub. Where else could he go? He just sat there, thinking about everything for a while, until, a few minutes later, a blaster bolt came flying his way. He dodged, turned around, but then he remembered he didn't have his lightsaber. So he just ran. The other two troopers must have already informed others about his force powers or something. So he ran until he got on a public transport. Sketchy public transport. From there, he took another public hyperlane transport directly to Alderaan. Who else could he turn to? Padme was missing, along with every Jedi, so Bail Organa seemed like the only option Anakin had right now. There were two troopers on the ship. He heard them talking about a Jedi that was discovered in the capital's lower levels. Anakin tried to stay hidden, but he still heard their conversation. Is this even possible? Jedi on Coruscant? After Order 66? Order 66? What were they talking about? Finally, he landed on Alderaan. He thought of the best way to contact Senator Organa, and just decided to stay close to his apartment complex until he ran into him. Thankfully, there were almost no troopers on Alderaan, so eventually, Anakin did see Senator Organa. He just stepped in front of him, and Organa immediately recognized him. He was hooded, but still, Anakin was too iconic not to notice. So Organa, in shock, led Anakin to one of his private rooms, and there he asked Anakin where he'd been all this time. The Republic declared him dead after the Battle of Felucia. Anakin explained everything, how he was captured, frozen in carbonite, released on the island and escaped to Coruscant, and eventually to here. Now it was Anakin's turn to ask questions. So he just asked, "Senator Organa, what the hell is going on?" Organa explained that he's not a senator anymore. After Anakin was declared dead, the Jedi relentlessly searched for him, especially his apprentice and master, but with no luck. So the war continued, and eventually, Palpatine was able to take over the galaxy and declared the Jedi traitors. And those clone troopers are now called stormtroopers. And they aren't the men Anakin once knew. Anakin was in shock. He just asked, "Where is Padme?" Organa's expression saddened as he explained that Padme was killed because she tried to resist, because she knew too much, and if they weren't careful, the same would happen to all of them. After this, Anakin needed a few days to process the information. Organa, of course, allowed him to stay in the apartment for as long as he wanted. A standard month later, the rebels were viciously fighting on Kurita. So far, the operation was a complete failure. Many great pilots were lost, but the rebels still stood their ground. For now, on the forested floors of the planet, the rebels were fighting the overwhelming Imperial forces, but it was definitely not going too well. As one of the rebels ran to take shelter, a rocket was launched his way. He covered his eyes, but slowly, after the blast, he opened them. A hooded figure stood before him. The vigilante had a black mask with a rebel emblem. How he redirected the rocket was a mystery to the rebels, but this gave them courage. And the battle quickly turned around. The vigilante didn't lead the rebels to a complete victory. That was impossible. The Academy housed over 150,000 stormtroopers, and their surprise attack was gone, but they inflicted significant damage. A while later, the same happened on Kashyyyk. As stormtroopers were searching for Jedi survivors, the Wookiees were hiding. The same figure saved the younglings and Padawans from a certain death. This continued throughout the entire galaxy, one battle after another. The vigilante was nothing short of legendary. Eventually, Palpatine became furious. His spy intelligence within the rebel forces discovered what only a few in the Alliance knew. The vigilante was the one and only Anakin Skywalker. That completely shocked Palpatine. How had he returned? Still, he wasn't too worried. No matter how powerful the boy was, the Emperor's forces were overwhelming, but perhaps he could still turn him to the dark side. It quickly became understood that the young rebel was Skywalker himself. It wasn't exactly broadcasted on the public holonet. A fearsome hero on the side of the rebels wouldn't help Imperial morale, but by the way the Empire was fighting, by their military tactics, it was obvious they were targeting only Anakin. Even with his hood and mask, they weren't using blasters, only heavy explosives. That had to mean the Emperor himself issued the order, and it was also obvious they weren't trying to kill a soldier. Their tactics and everything reminded of Mandalorians. No blasters, only large explosions that can actually kill a Jedi. So Anakin built a new lightsaber. He dropped the mask. He was Anakin Skywalker again, and soon the galaxy would find out. He led the rebels to countless victories, one after another. Every mission Anakin led was a success. Even the most unreasonable operations, a complete failure, was impossible with him. So Palpatine decided he would lure the Jedi into a trap. He publicly announced he would deliver a speech on his homeworld of Naboo. The rebels, of course, knew it was probably a trap, but the chance to kill the Emperor himself, it was worth it. Soon, Palpatine stood on a massive platform delivering his speech. Security was tight, but not too tight, not enough to stop a determined strike. The first wave came from the air. X-wings zipped across the sky, blasting down countless TIE fighters, but it was no use. The TIEs kept coming. It was endless. Meanwhile, a ground assault was launched. It took time for the rebel troops to arrive. They had to land deep in the forest to avoid detection and walk the rest of the way. But when they finally arrived, the true assault on the Emperor began. Palpatine was quickly evacuated into the royal palace itself. The defense was numerous, but nothing Anakin couldn't handle. Sadly, the same couldn't be said for the other rebels. The Imperial forces were overwhelming, but Anakin was a completely different beast. He sliced through hundreds upon hundreds of stormtroopers until finally he reached the Chancellor. It was obviously a trap, just like everything that had ever happened during the Clone Wars, but Anakin was confident in his skill. Behind the table, Palpatine sat, but standing beside him was Count Dooku. Organa forgot to mention that little detail, that Dooku was still alive, but he looked ancient. Not just Tatooine old, but great medical support old. He was deep into his 90s by now. Still, Dooku ignited his saber, and so did Anakin. And Anakin was surprised. Dooku was fighting well. Makashi never failed him. It was honestly impressive. Of course, age mattered in lightsaber combat, but what arguably mattered more was experience. And Dooku had plenty. He was just as skilled as Anakin remembered, but still, without Palpatine's help, he was no match for a 24-year-old Anakin Skywalker. The duel ended with Anakin holding his saber at Dooku's throat, when suddenly, lightning came crashing his way. He prepared himself for it, but he was still caught off guard by the raw power the Emperor was radiating through his fingers. Anakin stumbled back, then without hesitation leapt high over the table and came crashing down on the Emperor. Palpatine didn't even flinch as a red saber blocked the incoming attack. Anakin landed, but the doors behind Palpatine suddenly opened, and 6 of the strongest Inquisitors stepped into the room and ignited their sabers. Jarek, Dizan, Moff Kentor Sarn, they were all there. A fierce battle erupted on the palace's most prestigious table. Palpatine watched amusedly, until Anakin, after just a few seconds, managed to slice off Dizan's hand. That was enough to show Skywalker's true power. Palpatine jumped in, and the tide turned immediately. Anakin barely held on, and after a short, desperate struggle, Palpatine cut Anakin's saber in half. Anakin leaned against the wall behind him as Palpatine stepped forward, speaking with cold authority, urging Anakin to embrace the dark side. It would be a shame to waste such potential. He could serve as the Emperor's new apprentice. Suddenly, Palpatine noticed a smirk on Anakin's face. He unleashed a powerful lightning strike, electrocuting him, and Anakin collapsed to the floor. But he managed to speak. "Chancellor, I never planned on killing you myself, you traitor," he said with a raspy, cold voice. Palpatine was confused. Anakin pulled out a trigger from beneath his robe. The Inquisitors looked around and saw mines everywhere. On the table, on the floor, where Anakin fought Dooku. The entire room was rigged. Anakin must have placed them without anyone noticing. "Your overconfidence is your weakness," Anakin said, pressing the button. The room exploded. The very foundations of the royal palace shook as the blast swallowed them all. Suddenly, silence. The room was completely destroyed. Walls, ceiling, floor, all gone. Though many rebels hadn't made it far, this was definitely a victory for the Alliance. But the war, of course, was far from over. One of the Inquisitors guarding the door barely escaped. He was heavily scarred, but alive. It was High Inquisitor Tremaine himself. The only part of his scarred, robotic face that was left was now gone, and he was more terrifying than ever before. The other surviving Inquisitors weren't high-ranking enough to take over the Empire. That honor would fall to Grand Moff Tarkin. But Tremaine was different. He had served directly under Lord Tyrannus and managed to seize control of the Galactic Empire. So, the war continued. Yet, what kept the rebels thriving more than anything was their public image. Anakin, the legendary Jedi Knight, had given his life for democracy. In the Senate, senators gave him a thunderous applause. Many were executed, but there were too many anyway. The war went on. Without Palpatine, Dooku, and many Inquisitors. And somewhere deep in the Outer Rim, Master Yoda looked up at the stars and smiled, feeling the darkness finally beginning to vanish from the galaxy.